After a series of bad choices and struggles with the law, 39-year-old Paul Skiba had turned his life around. He started his own moving business, purchased a home, and was working towards a better future. His entire world revolved around his 9-year-old daughter, Sarah. Paul and Sarah's mother had divorced when she was young, and Paul had fought for a custody agreement which would give him as much time as possible to spend with Sarah. Paul had an on-again, off-again relationship with Teresa Donovan, and late in 1998, Teresa gave birth to a son. While Paul took his role as a father seriously, he questioned the child's paternity and had no intentions of staying in a relationship with Teresa. In February of 1999, he told friends and family that he would be telling Teresa to move out, and he'd be taking her to court to battle for custody of their son. While Paul tried to schedule work around Sarah's visits, one of his employees needed a day off to make funeral arrangements. Paul decided that he'd bring Sarah to work with him that day to cover the shift, along with another employee, Lorenzo Chivers. The three drove off in a moving truck on Sunday, February 7, 1999, and were never seen again. A battle ensued between Paul and Sarah's families, along with Lorenzo's, who felt that something terrible had happened, and the police, who believed this was a situation of a father abducting his non-custodial child. Despite their refusal to examine things more closely, police had no choice when evidence was discovered in the parking lot of the business, which pointed to foul play. Suddenly, it became clear that the three had not chosen to run off. What happened to Paul and Sarah Skiba and Lorenzo Cheveux? Was Paul the target of a violent crime, and the others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was it an ambush designed to eliminate competition, or perhaps solve a personal vendetta? Or did someone in Paul's life want to stop him from moving on and leaving them behind? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 53, The Colorado Triple Murder of Paul and Sarah Skiba and Lorenzo Chivers. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today I examine the 1999 Colorado triple murder. It's a disturbing story of murder, lies, and investigative mistakes. Before moving into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focusing on a different unsolved case each week. Subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcatcher. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at TraceEvPod, on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, transcripts, social media links, merchandise, and much more. Trace Evidence is also on Patreon, so if you'd like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can get rewards such as stickers, pins, and commercial-free episodes. There's also a PayPal donation link on the website for those of you who don't wish to go through Patreon. This show is a complete one-man operation, and your support is greatly appreciated. Trace Evidence is now a part of the Murderly Podcast Network. Visit murder.ly for more information and many other amazing true crime podcasts. Today I examine the Colorado triple murder of Paul and Sarah Skiba and Lorenzo Chivers. This is an absolutely baffling case, surrounded by a great deal of rumor and suspicion. For 19 years, the suspects have evaded capture, though many believe their names are well known to authorities. This is Episode 53, The Colorado Triple Murder. Sarah Ariel Skiba was born on July 27, 1989, to parents Paul Skiba and Michelle Russell. Relations between Paul and Michelle were stressed at the time, and according to friends and family, their marriage was on the rocks. Michelle and Paul had met several years earlier under what many have considered a complicated set of circumstances. Paul's past had some mistakes in it. He'd moved to Colorado in 1981, fleeing from a pending court date related to misdemeanor drug charges in his hometown of Centerville, Minnesota. Upon arrival, he began seeking work under the alias Craig Nelson, but was eventually arrested on an outstanding warrant from the previous charge. Following adjudication of the charge, Paul went back to using his real name. Paul, though, didn't necessarily steer clear of trouble at this time. In 1988, he pleaded guilty to a false reporting charge in Boulder County. 2 years later, in 1990, he was charged with harassment, but ultimately pled guilty to disorderly conduct. Then, the next year, in 1991, he was convicted of menacing in Douglas County. He was placed on probation for 2 years, and just around the time this probation ended, in 1993, Paul was charged with disorderly conduct and a separate charge related to marijuana possession. Paul hadn't come to Colorado alone. He was in a relationship with a woman who moved along with him, and the two set themselves up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Westminster. Around that time, Paul began working for a company, Student Movers, and Michelle was in a relationship with a coworker. While the details surrounding the end of Paul's relationship haven't been publicly acknowledged, it is known that following its termination, he and Michelle began seeing one another. The relationship moved quickly, with Michelle moving in with Paul, getting married, and Michelle becoming pregnant with Sarah in 1988. Shortly after Sarah's birth, the couple separated and a bitter divorce took place. Michelle moved nearly 100 miles away to Granby, Colorado, taking Sarah with her. Paul would later move to Thornton, which is located in Adams and Weld counties in the northwest quadrant of the Denver-Aurora-Broomfield metropolitan area. It's located approximately 10 miles north of Denver and boasts a population of 118,000 residents. Granby, by contrast, is located in Grand County and is 85 miles northwest of Denver with a population of less than 2,000. Suffice it to say, by way of the eventuality of custody, Sarah would experience both the liveliness and excitement of being near a big city, while also living with her mother in a quiet, more rural area. Paul was upset about the split, but more so about the move and its effect on his ability to see Sarah as often as he'd like. After many days in court, a visitation schedule was arranged. Paul would see Sarah on Wednesdays, as well as every other weekend during the school year. Paul would have full custody during summer break, with Michelle having visitation during that time. It's been stated that Paul was absolutely in love with his daughter, and fought as hard as he could to see her as frequently as the court would allow. The Wednesday visits were difficult, requiring Paul to drive to Granby, where he'd rent a hotel room for the night. On those Wednesdays, Paul would pick up Sarah from school and they'd spend the day together. Sarah loved swimming, and so Paul always ensured that the hotel room he'd rented that night was at a location with a swimming pool. Bob Martinez, a longtime friend of Paul's, when asked about the relationship between father and daughter, stated, quote, "Paul and Sarah were beautiful together. They were like a Hallmark card. Sarah was Paul's whole world. He'd do anything he could for that girl. Sarah was always happy and full of spunk." End quote. Sarah was described by everyone as an incredibly sweet, kind, and active young girl. She was especially fond of rollerblading and riding her bike through the summer. Paul would often take Sarah on trips, Whether they were snowboarding, skiing, or camping together, it was clear that Sarah had a lot of love for the outdoors and everything that went along with being a child of nature. Outside of the realm of adventure, Sarah's next love was school. As she grew older, she became more interested in her classes, and according to Michelle, would run to the bus in the morning, just so excited to get to school for that day. The relationship between Paul and Michelle may have been strained, but they were civil to one another for Sarah's sake. While they certainly weren't communicating regularly, whenever Sarah was picked up or dropped off, they'd exchange pleasantries and reserve any animosity which may have existed. As the years began to progress, and Sarah grew older, she became more acutely aware of the divide, but never experienced negativity in relation to it. For the most part, Paul and Michelle were actively aware of Sarah's response, and worked hard to ensure that her life was in no way disrupted by their separation. For Paul, the days during which he wasn't in custody of Sarah were filled with thoughts of her. His house has been said to have had nearly 70 pictures of Sarah, and according to coworkers, Paul was always thinking of her. On one particular outing, Paul spotted a rocking chair sitting near a dumpster. He quickly threw it into his truck and explained that he would reupholster the chair for Sarah's room. It was clear to everyone who knew Paul that his daughter was his top priority. Paul had worked various jobs throughout his life. He'd been employed installing sprinkler systems, building baby carriages, and as a mover for student movers. Moving seemed to suit Paul, and though he eventually left Student Movers for another moving company, there was something about that particular line of work which made him feel fulfilled. According to close friend and former neighbor Jerry Bybee, quote, "He had places he wanted to go, visions of what he wanted to be in his life. He came a long way in the 15 years that I knew him." End quote. Ultimately, Paul's boss at his last moving company informed him that he was going to shut the business down and move on. Paul immediately began negotiations to purchase the trucks from him, and having successfully done so, began his own business, which he called Tough Movers. Paul was very good at his work and took it seriously. His work ethic was described as exceptionally careful and detail-oriented. He was a man of his word, coming through on his promises, and he didn't say he could do something if he couldn't. He would find a way. The only time Paul was apt to tell someone no or to turn a job down was if it interfered with his schedule of seeing Sarah. Paul was a popular guy and a flashy dresser. He appreciated a unique approach to style, and according to friends, he frequented secondhand shops in search of designer clothing. He frequently wore suspenders and vests, and his clothing style applied to his social circle as well. Paul was a friendly man, and conversation was easy for him. He was a smooth talker and knew how to make people feel comfortable around him. That, combined with a genuine sense of interest in their lives, helped expand his social circle, which, in turn, would aid in the expansion of his business. Jerry would later say, quote, "He was my best friend, but I wasn't necessarily his. He knew hundreds of people." End quote. In business, Paul maintained his kind personality in conjunction with a firm hand. As Tough Movers grew, he'd take on new employees, and he also understood, in the moving business, sometimes things are going to break. He was said to discipline employees, but to be open to giving them a second chance. However, Paul's open heart sometimes put him in a position where he wouldn't hire the greatest crews. Bob Martinez later said, quote, "He would give you the shirt off his back. That's how he was with his employees. He hired some shady folks, but it was because they needed help. They needed work. He just treated people great." End quote. In 1990, when Paul turned 30 years old, his parents divorced. At this time, he reached out to his mother, Sharon, and insisted that she move down to Colorado to live with him. At first, Sharon moved into Paul's apartment, but they later moved to a new apartment in Castle Rock. Finally, in 1993, Paul purchased a home in Thornton. Paul was committed to looking after his mother and ensuring that she was happy, and in turn, Sharon provided care for Sarah when Paul was working. The arrangement went well for the two of them, and Sharon loved developing her relationship with her granddaughter. The two spent a lot of time together and had a Saturday ritual of shopping together. There are a myriad of stories about Paul helping friends out when times were tough. In regard to Bob, when his drinking became a problem for his family, it was Paul that his wife turned to for help. When his friend Rich Leymeister's wife passed away after a battle with cancer, Paul pitched in as much as he could to help Rich and the children. Rich would later marry his second wife, Carol, and Paul ensured that she was quickly accepted into the social circle. When asked about Paul, Carol would later say, quote, "Paul had the biggest heart, polite and willing to help anyone," end quote. Perhaps it was Paul's big heart which led him to maintain a connection to a very back-and-forth relationship. Shortly after the finalization of his divorce, Paul's friend Jerry introduced him to Teresa Donovan at a Halloween party. The two would embark on a very on-again, off-again relationship. While Paul was well-liked by all around him, opinions of Teresa were not nearly as kind. Teresa was 10 years younger than Paul, who by the mid-90s was in his mid-30s, having been born in 1960. Teresa was unable to work and was on disability as the result of arthritis in her legs, and Paul was very much invested in ensuring her comfort and care. On multiple occasions, it was described that Paul would carry Teresa up and down the stairs when her legs were acting up, and he was willing to do whatever he could to make her feel at ease. There were periods of time during their relationship that Teresa would stay at the house, and while Paul enjoyed having her there, Sharon wasn't a fan of her son's girlfriend. Sharon would later say, quote, "He needed somebody decent. I didn't like her around Sarah," end quote. According to Sharon, Teresa wasn't very sociable or kind, and oftentimes when Paul had visitors over to the house, Teresa would stay in bed and elect to not even say hello. The relationship had its fair share of issues, with Paul questioning Teresa's fidelity. The pair would break up and get back together several times. In late 1997, Paul and Teresa split up for what many thought would be the last time. They stayed apart for several months, but then in early 1998, Paul and Teresa met up and had an intimate encounter. Weeks later, Teresa called Paul and told him that she was pregnant. Friends have said that Paul questioned the legitimacy of the claim that he was the father, but for the time being, he was planning to ensure that both Teresa and the unborn child were taken care of. In April of 1998, he rented a trailer for Teresa to live in, and then in November, as her due date approached, he moved her into his home. Their relationship was still strained, but Paul went to great lengths to make sure that things remained civil. After the birth of the child, a boy, Paul is alleged to have confessed to his brother that he was planning to have a paternity test conducted, but until then, he would have both living with him, as he didn't believe Teresa was capable of taking care of the child on her own. By early February of 1999, Paul was becoming more exasperated by the situation. Things were made more complicated when Sharon had to go back to Minnesota. Her mother had passed away, and Sharon had to deal with her apartment, paperwork, and the emotional difficulties of the loss, leaving Paul to fend for himself with Teresa and the baby, as well as trying to continue to maintain his balance of time with Sarah. Paul drove Sharon to the airport, and according to her, during the drive, explained that he was going to ask his lawyers to file papers in regard to a paternity test. Sharon wasn't the only one to hear this story. According to Rich Leymeister, he and his wife went over to Paul's house for dinner in early February, shortly after Sharon had left town, and Paul was very upset. Rich would later say that, after dinner, the two men had gone down into the basement, at which point Paul is alleged to have said that Teresa wasn't contributing. According to Rich, Paul stated that he'd found Teresa partying with neighbors instead of looking after the baby, and that he was aware that on more than one occasion, Teresa had left Sarah, now 9 years old, in charge of taking care of the baby by herself. It's been stated that Paul confided in Rich that he was planning to have the paternity test done soon after, and if the child wasn't his, he'd be throwing Teresa out of his home, and if the child was, then he'd be taking her to court and seeking full custody. It was clear at this point to everyone in Paul's life that he'd reached his limit with Teresa. On Friday, February 5th, Paul was scheduled to pick up Sarah from school for the weekend. Michelle drove Sarah to the bus stop that icy morning and attended a scrape Sarah received when she slipped. Paul arrived and picked up Sarah at approximately 3:30 p.m. and drove her back to his home in Thornton. According to Sharon, she'd called Paul on Friday night, but he was busy preparing dinner for Sarah. During this conversation, Sharon alleges that Paul told her he was telling Teresa that he wanted her out of the house by Sunday. He told Sharon that he'd call her Sunday night and let her know what happened. Paul made plans the following day, Saturday, February 6th, to watch Jerry's 11-year-old son, Matthew. Jerry was out on a moving job, and Matthew and Sarah were friends and often played together. According to Jerry, things between Paul and Teresa hit a peak that day, as Matthew later reported that he and Sarah spent most of the day outside in order to avoid a loud argument that was taking place in the house. Jerry was also scheduled to work that Sunday, the 7th, but had asked Paul if he could have the day off. Jerry's grandfather had passed away, and they were trying to get everything in order, and according to Jerry, Paul told him that he'd work his shift for him and just bring Sarah along for a spur-of-the-moment father-daughter workday. This would be the last time Jerry would ever speak to Paul. On the morning of Monday, February 8th, Jerry was running late. He and his family had shared some drinks during their morning process, and he'd overindulged and gotten ill. He felt terrible, but rushed to make it to work. When he arrived, he found what he thought to be a strange situation. The trucks for Tough Movers were kept in a fenced-in parking lot at 72nd Avenue and Raleigh in Westminster, and Jerry recalls arriving sometime between 9:30 and 10 a.m. That morning, Jerry was scheduled to go on a moving job with Paul, as well as another employee, Lorenzo Chivers. Outside of the gates, Jerry noticed that the truck was parked differently than it usually was. Paul was in the habit of backing into a specific spot, and according to Jerry, quote, Paul was a neat freak, anal about everything, end quote. The truck had been pulled into the spot, front first, and was parked crooked. Jerry assumed that there must be some story about why the truck was parked poorly, and stated, quote, I was waiting for him to come in ranting about something that had gone wrong. It looked like somebody had just pulled in the yard at 50 miles per hour and hit the brakes, end quote. When Jerry attempted to get into the yard, he was denied access. The lock on the fence had been changed, but this wasn't necessarily a sign of anything wrong. Paul was known to change the lock whenever he fired an employee, and so Jerry simply assumed that something had gone wrong and Paul had let someone go. Jerry waited outside of the gate, but neither Paul nor Lorenzo arrived. Around this same time, Michelle was on the phone with the police. Paul hadn't brought Sarah back after the weekend per their custodial arrangement. This wouldn't be the first time the former couple had been to court over issues regarding custody, but Michelle was more concerned now than usual. She had recently told Paul that she was planning to move out of the state, and Paul hadn't received the information very well. She began calling Paul at 5 p.m. on Sunday, but never received an answer. Fearing that Paul may have run off with Sarah in order to avoid this situation, the Grand County Sheriff's Department took Michelle's report and filed a warrant for Paul's arrest. The warrant was officially filed on February 10th. At the time, they didn't believe Sarah was in any danger, and this was hardly the first situation they dealt with in relation to a non-custodial parental abduction. The problem was, at the time, the Grand County Sheriff's Department was only aware that Paul and Sarah were missing. The third person who also didn't arrive that morning was Paul's employee, Lorenzo Chivers. Chivers had been working for Paul for the past few months and had been hired through a connection through Teresa. Chivers, at the time, was living with Teresa's sister, Bobby Jo. Lorenzo was known to be a polite and kind man who wasn't prone to disappearing. He was the father of 2 children, a 15-year-old son who lived with him, and a 12-year-old daughter who lived with her mother. It was out of the ordinary for Lorenzo to be out of contact, and especially to not return home. According to Lorenzo's son, Josh, he hadn't returned home from work Sunday evening as he was expected to. Josh immediately called Misha, Lorenzo's ex. While the two were separated, they maintained good contact and were actually in the midst of discussions about reconciling. Misha called Bobby Jo, wondering if she'd heard from Lorenzo or had any idea about his possible whereabouts. In a bizarre statement, Misha alleged that Bobby Jo replied, quote, "I know he's not coming home. I know something horrible has happened to him." End quote. Around the time that Misha was speaking to Bobby Jo on Monday morning, Teresa called Sharon. According to Sharon, Teresa explained that Paul hadn't come home either. She'd spoken to her sister about Lorenzo not coming home, and so the 2 women had called the police to report them missing. Sharon was thrown for a loop. Paul was supposed to call her Sunday night, and while it was unlike him to not follow through, she'd assumed he'd been busy, or perhaps things with Teresa had escalated into a dispute since that was the day Paul wanted her out. Sharon called the Thornton Police Department and spoke with Detective Dante Carbone. According to Sharon, Carbone didn't feel concerned and suggested that Paul may have taken Sarah out somewhere and they'd lost track of time. Sharon urged Detective Carbone that something was wrong, and Paul was not known to simply go on a trip spur of the moment, especially considering his custody arrangement. Neither the Sheriff's Department nor the Thornton Police Department took the case very seriously from the outset. While a warrant for Paul had been issued, and a missing persons report had also been filed, there weren't any major actions. Police paid a visit to Paul's home, though they didn't stay for very long, and outside of being aware of the missing status, they were fairly certain that Paul would resurface, and so not very many, if any, resources were dedicated to locating Paul or Sarah, let alone Lorenzo. In fact, it wouldn't be until 2 days later, on Wednesday, February 10th, that a police officer from the Westminster Police Department agreed to meet Jerry at the Tough Movers lot and examine the trucks. According to Jerry, the responding officer didn't seem very interested. When he asked Jerry to unlock the gate, he explained that he didn't have the key. The officer at this point pulled his cruiser up to the fence, climbed onto the hood, and hopped over. Jerry examined the lot and saw a large puddle of motor oil with a board of wood lying over it. Thinking this was bizarre, he pointed it out to the officer, who he says responded with, quote, "Can you prove he didn't change his oil?" End quote. Jerry then approached the trucks, which he'd previously noticed one had been parked in a strange manner. He climbed up and peered through the windows, trying not to touch anything as he did so. It struck him that the interior of the truck was clean, and he told the officer that the trucks usually weren't very clean on the inside since they spent so much time in them. While Jerry had attempted to preserve the scene, the officer strode up to the cab of the truck, opened the door, and looked inside. According to Jerry, the officer had no gloves on, and, if nothing else, seemed annoyed by the fact that he'd been sent to the location. Jerry later said, quote, "I feel he destroyed more evidence than he was willing to look at. To him, there was nothing unusual there. I was disgusted with him." End quote. When the police officer left that day, he expressed that he felt there were no indications that any crimes had been committed, nor did he feel anything was out of the ordinary. Jerry firmly disagreed. Another day would pass with authorities treating the case of the missing individuals as though there was no possibility that it could be linked to a crime. This is odd in general, as a missing child with a non-custodial parent would typically result in more action, but in this situation, there seems to be no explanation for the lackadaisical approach. On Thursday night, Misha took Lorenzo's son, Josh, over to his father's so he could pick up some clothing. He'd been staying with her since Lorenzo had gone missing. Things took another bizarre turn in connection to Bobby Joe, who had previously made the strange statement about Lorenzo not coming back. When they arrived, they found all of Josh's belongings packed in boxes, waiting near the front door, and his room was empty. It didn't make any sense, and Misha felt that it was strange that after Lorenzo had been missing for, at this point, just over 3 days, Bobby Joe had already made the decision that he wasn't coming home, and so Josh shouldn't live there any longer. Sharon spoke to Teresa on the phone several times during that week. Each conversation seemed progressively more and more bizarre, and on one occasion, Sharon has said that Teresa claimed to have been to a psychic. According to the alleged psychic, Paul and Sarah were dead, and Paul's car had been abandoned at a gravelly area near a lake or river. This strange conversation left Sharon feeling that something was incredibly wrong, and she couldn't help but feel that Teresa knew more than she was saying. The story about the psychic has struck many as an utterly bizarre detail of an already remarkably mystifying case. Sharon was also calling the Thornton police every day, looking for updates. With each call, she became more and more frustrated. The police felt that, after several days had passed, Paul had likely run off with Sarah in hopes of avoiding issues related to custody with Michelle. They assured Sharon that he'd come back eventually and turn himself in, but Sharon was just as ardent and insistent that Paul wasn't on the run, and even if he were, he'd have called her by now. His home and business were in Thornton. He had nowhere else to go, and the longer he was away, the more likely it was that he'd lose everything. It just didn't make any sense. Sharon finally made it back to town on Saturday, February 13th, and frustrated with the lack of effort on the part of investigators, personally hired a helicopter. She planned to fly to the location of the Tough Movers lot and then scan the surrounding areas on the hunt for Paul's car, a 1972 Chevelle. Unfortunately, nothing was found during that search. On Sunday, February 14th, Rich Leymeister received a strange phone call from Teresa. She explained to him that Paul was missing, and surprisingly, this was the first he'd heard of it. Rich and his wife volunteered to help out by posting flyers around town. The flyers had information about Paul and Sarah, as well as a description of Paul's car, though at the time, it listed the wrong license plate number. Later in the afternoon, Rich got in touch with Sharon and asked her what was going on, but she had few answers to provide. They arranged to meet at the Tough Movers lot. Rich was familiar with the location as he had done mechanic work for Paul on the trucks in the past, and just like Jerry, he noticed the odd way the truck was parked and felt something wasn't right. With the gate still being locked, Rich and his wife climbed over the fence to inspect the area while Sharon waited on the other side. Almost immediately upon approaching the truck, they noted several things which both frightened and disturbed them. It's important to clarify, there were at least two vehicles in the lot. There was what has been referred to as the big truck, and another which has been most recently referred to as the truck that Rich had worked on. As Rich got closer to the truck he'd worked on, he noted the large oil stain which he found to be strange, but then he noticed what appeared to be bullet holes in the side of the truck. Looking closer, Carol spotted a smear of blood on the big truck's door. Lying near the windshield was what both believed to be a piece of flesh. Immediately, the two turned to exit the parking lot, with Rich later saying, quote, "When we found that, we decided to get out and call police." End quote. They were obviously a little panicked, and when they climbed back over the fence, Sharon could see it. All Rich would say to her was that it didn't look good, and Sharon immediately got on the phone to her other son and her ex-husband, telling them that they needed to get to Colorado. The next call was to the police. In a twist, which at this point shouldn't be shocking, the Westminster police arrived on the scene, and rather than taking things seriously, instead insisted to Rich, Carol, and Sharon that Paul had run off with Sarah and there was nothing at the lot to suggest any kind of a crime had been committed. Rich later said, quote, "They threatened to arrest us if we didn't leave because there was no crime committed and we should all go home." End quote. Rich argued with the police, telling them that the big truck was far too clean on the inside and that he'd found bullet holes and blood on the other one. Investigators told Rich that someone could have shot at the truck at any time when it was out somewhere, and for the blood, well, maybe someone cut themselves. It was at this point that Rich explained that the truck with the bullet holes didn't have an engine in it. He was still working on it, and there weren't bullet holes in it the last time he'd been there. Rich implored investigators to use luminol or other forensic methods at the scene in order to determine what happened, but they refused. Sharon was going to the airport, where her son and her ex were already arriving, this argument having gone on long enough for them to fly into the state, and so she called Bob Martinez to come down and support Rich and Carol. The police, upon finally listening about the bullet holes and blood, were now embroiled in a bitter debate about who held jurisdiction over the scene. It was mind-blowing to Rich, who felt that it wasn't about who wanted jurisdiction, it was about trying to pass the buck on to someone else. Bob was also shocked by the argument between the police, and later said, quote, "I was like, Jesus Christ, it happened in Westminster, it's your jurisdiction. Do what you need to do." And they couldn't see it that way. End quote. Finally, an officer from the Thornton Police Department arrived, and it was determined that Thornton would handle the case, since that was where the missing persons report on Paul had been filed. At approximately 3 a.m. on Monday, February 15th, officers took down information for where they could reach Sharon, Bob, Rich, and Carol, and sent them home. They explained that they were going to tow the trucks away to process them for evidence. Sharon requested that the officers lock the gate back up when they left to secure the scene. The next morning, when she came to check, the gate had been left wide open and no police tape had been used to close off the scene. The local media was relayed the story Monday morning, though when they ran reports on television, it wasn't exactly described accurately. Reporters depicted this as a case of 3 missing persons, though they specified that investigators believed it was in relation to a custody battle. Even at this point, regardless of all the evidence which seemed to suggest that something very bad had happened, police still felt this wasn't a crime outside of Paul running off with Sarah. I suppose they believed that Lorenzo just went along for the adventure. That same morning, Paul's parents and brother, along with Rich, Carol, Jerry, and Bob, began searching all over the area. They used the Tough Movers parking lot as a center point, and began examining every street, parking lot, apartment complex, and construction site within a multi-mile radius of that point. They even walked the area, checking culverts and open fields, searching for drag marks, signs of blood or a struggle, anything which might lead them to finding what had happened. This search went on for 2 full days before finally, on Wednesday, February 17th, Jerry found Lorenzo's car in a Westminster parking lot. Examination of Lorenzo's car revealed nothing out of the ordinary, other than the fact that there were no fingerprints found. Police had taken possession of the car, and so the search for anything else continued, but nothing was ultimately found. After a week of desperately searching, Paul's brother had to get back to Minnesota. Frustrated with investigators and feeling overwhelmingly that something had happened to Paul, he left town on February 21st. Several days after he left, the Denver Police Department located Paul's 72 Chevelle at an apartment complex near South Federal and West Arkansas. The vehicle was covered in splashes of mud, and inside, police found Paul's personal belongings, as well as Sarah's backpack, still stuffed with Beanie Babies. Despite the dirty appearance of the car, just like Lorenzo's, there were no fingerprints recovered. Several weeks passed with little information given out about what may have happened and what was found while processing the evidence. During this time, Sharon struggled to try and keep Tough Movers operating so that, when Paul returned, he'd still have his business waiting for him. She reached out to the Thornton police and requested that one of the trucks be returned so that the business could continue to function, assuming that they'd completed their processing. The police agreed, and one of the trucks was returned. To Sharon's shock and surprise, upon receiving the truck, she found bits of flesh and hair stuck to the hood, at which point she called the police and asked, quote, "Do you normally give back a vehicle that still has evidence on it?" End quote. The police returned to the lot to take the truck back, but this time, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation got involved. The CBI employed several forensic techniques which the Thornton Police Department had elected not to, including luminol, which Rich had previously requested and been denied. Upon application of the luminol, the CBI discovered blood all over the back of the big truck, as well as inside the cab. The oil spill, as it turned out, was a large pool of blood which had had motor oil poured over it in an attempt to cover it up. DNA testing was issued on the blood, as well as the flesh and hair which had been discovered. Test results concluded that the blood belonged to both Paul and Sarah, and based upon the large quantities located in and around the vehicle, the blood loss was likely the result of fatal wounds. The piece of flesh was determined to be a piece of Paul's scalp. Additional hair found on the fender belonged to Sarah. In the middle of March, some 5 weeks after Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo had originally been reported missing, the Thornton Police Department, in conjunction with the CBI, finally announced that they had enough evidence to suggest that this was likely not a disappearance related to custody and that foul play was probable. During this same time, Sharon was sorting through Paul's personal papers while still living in the home with Teresa. It was found that he was in possession of a $100,000 life insurance policy on Sarah and a smaller one on both Sarah and Sharon. There were concerns about Paul's beneficiary, as well as who would legally retain control of the business. Teresa finally moved out of the home in the late stages of March, at which point Sharon changed all of the locks, but this wouldn't be the last Sharon would hear from Teresa. In early April, she went to court to argue that she, and not Sharon, should have full custody of Paul's assets. Sharon had already been appointed temporary conservator of Paul's estate, being his next of kin, so that she could pay his bills, including his 2 mortgages on the home, life insurance premiums, and operating funds to keep the business going. A hearing was set for April 16th. The debate would be about whether or not Teresa and Paul were married and or planned to marry. The hearing took place at the Adams County Probate Court. Teresa argued that the couple were planning to marry and that her son with Paul was the rightful heir to Paul's assets. Teresa stated, quote, "He is the only heir. If they never come back, he's the only heir to everything that Paul had. Paul always wanted, if Sarah was here, Paul would have wanted Sarah to have his things. He always wanted his children to have his things." End quote. She went on to argue that the couple had planned to marry and that Paul had purchased a ring, which he'd given to her, and she always considered herself married to him. She went on further, saying that she didn't use Paul's legal name on documents because it could jeopardize her insurance policy, as well as arguing that the trailer Paul had purchased for them was for them to live together since Teresa and Sharon didn't get along, and she pointed out that, on the application for that purchase, they'd listed themselves as married. Sharon's lawyers called in witnesses who contradicted much, if not all, of what Teresa had stated. The trailer park manager stated that, originally, Paul had listed Teresa as his girlfriend, and she'd explained to him that it would be cheaper for them to rent the trailer if they filed as a married couple. Paul's accountant testified that Paul had filed his taxes as single, and multiple friends of Paul's had added that not only was Paul not married to Teresa, but he had no intentions of marrying her either. Ultimately, Judge Phelps ruled that there was no common law marriage in play, further stating, quote, "We can't be married some of the time and not the rest of the time. You're either married or you're not. You can't have it both ways." I would also note, as an aside, it would seem to me that if Mr. Skiba had intended to be married, it would probably have been Sharon Skiba who would be getting the trailer, and not Miss Donovan. End quote. Sharon's appointment left her in control of Paul's assets, and also responsible for his bills. Since Paul had signed the birth certificate for Teresa's son, the judge ordered that child support payments be put in place and added to the bills Sharon had to pay. The investigation at this point was in full swing after having faced multiple delays related to investigators' arguments that a crime hadn't been committed. What vital information or evidence may have been lost in those first days remains unknown, but Sharon later stated that an investigator told her they believed they'd have solved the case by the end of the year. Investigators first canvassed the area around the lot for witnesses who may have seen the comings and goings of the truck on Sunday, February 7th, the last day Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo were seen. According to multiple witnesses, the big truck had been seen driving out of the lot sometime between 7 and 8 p.m., returning later at approximately midnight. For police, this indicated that the bodies related to the crime may have been driven elsewhere, but couldn't be more than a couple of hours away, which narrowed down the search radius. They also discovered, while processing the trucks for evidence, that a ramp was missing from one of the vehicles. Initially, police believed that this ramp may have been removed for the purpose of attaching to the bodies to submerge them in a river or lake. In addition to the ramp, moving blankets and straps were also missing. They also reported finding vegetation in the radiator, which implied that the vehicle had been near a body of water. Police utilized bloodhounds to assist in searches, as well as employing a team from NecroSearch International. Beyond this, police also employed several psychics to assist, though none were ever able to lead investigators to the bodies. Thornton detective Pat Long worked the case and developed a theory that the crime had been committed by more than one person. It was Long's belief that this was not a random incident and that whoever had been responsible likely knew Paul's business schedule and knew that the truck would be returning to the lot that evening. It has frequently been referred to as an ambush in the media, with many believing that the suspects laid in wait for the return, planning to attack under the cover of night. In an interesting turn, one witness reported hearing a woman screaming near the lot on the night of February 7th. Jerry, when speaking to police, informed them that he'd spoken to Teresa in the days after the disappearance, and she had alleged to have been to the lot that night, but Jerry claimed she asked him not to share that information with anyone. In subsequent televised interviews, Teresa had a lot to say about the case. In one interview, she alleged that police had issued her a lie detector test and then told her that she'd failed. She maintained that she had nothing to do with the crime, stating, quote, "I'd never hurt them. The police have tried to say I killed them or I had them killed." End quote. Teresa had her own theory. In her mind, there was a small group of individuals who may have been responsible. According to Teresa, Paul had rented out spaces in his lot in the past as a way to make extra money. Several of these individuals, she alleged, were drug dealers and had, on several occasions, sold drugs to Paul. At some point, Paul decided it was best to stay away from them and to try and avoid the drugs, and so he told them not to come back to the lot. When they did, he's alleged to have had their vehicles towed away. Teresa would go on to say, quote, "They were the only people that could have killed him. I don't know if it was over the cars or anger over Paul trying to get off the coke." End quote. Teresa claimed that she'd told authorities about this, but that they were more interested in focusing on her and didn't investigate this angle. Jerry felt there were several possibilities. He thought that while Paul had done a lot to help others, he'd also struck some people the wrong way or had been involved in arguments with people. In an interview, Jerry stated, quote, "Paul was a great guy, but he did have his enemies. People he had fired because they'd get in an argument or something would get broken." End quote. One of these individuals, interestingly enough, was Tom Donovan, Teresa's brother. According to Jerry, Paul had fired Tom just a few weeks prior to the disappearance. He described Tom as an angry man with a bad temper, and recalled that just a few weeks after the disappearance, while he was driving one of the Tough Mover trucks to a job, Tom had thrown rocks at the vehicle and screamed out, "You're next." Sharon also relayed a story in which she alleges that Tom called her at home and told her that not only was he glad that Paul was dead, but that he and Sarah had been shot in the head and that he was going to shoot Sharon too. Tom later filed paperwork and took Sharon to court in regard to a debt which he alleged that was owed to him by Paul. The proceeding was tense and full of animosity, with Tom outwardly displaying anger towards Sharon. According to Bob Martinez, who had accompanied her to court that day, Tom made a disturbing gesture towards Sharon. Bob stated, quote, "He actually looked at Sharon, made his hand look like a gun, and motioned like he shot her." End quote. While Tom was clearly an angry individual who had a major problem with Paul, his family, and friends, there were others who were considered possibilities as well. Paul's cousin, Herbert Michael Himes, had previously partnered with Paul on the Tough Movers business. They had worked well together, but in the late 80s, Himes was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison for aggravated robbery. Upon his release, he went back to working with Paul, but was later fired when Paul claimed to have seen him stealing money. According to Rich Leymeister, Himes was angry about it and wanted revenge. Himes, when reached for comment, responded, quote, "I quit the business because I was making more money in the stock market. I don't know nothing about this case. Kiss my ass." End quote. While Himes obviously sounds like a delightful person, another popular suspect of the time was the missing third person, Lorenzo Chivers. The idea that Lorenzo may have possibly been involved seems to come directly out of the fact that throughout all of the blood and evidence found in the truck and at the parking lot, not a single drop of anything related to Lorenzo was located. Lorenzo's ex, Misha, was very upset about the theory and reached out to the local media, asking them not to treat him as some criminal. He was a father and a good man, and he too was missing. And for Misha, it was heartbreaking and outrageous that he would even be talked about as a possible suspect while his children sat at home wondering what had happened to their father. While a lot of speculation was coming out, and theories about possible suspects were being spread all over town, the investigation itself found little to imply why this crime happened and where the missing individuals might be. Months began passing, and soon, years, and all the while the families were left in the dark, and police failed to find additional clues. There were whispers, some from local criminals, others from inmates, but every lead which was presented led only to a dead end. It wouldn't be until 2005, some 6 years after the disappearance, that police would publicly state what they believed happened. In the years in between, things got rough for Sharon. As time passed, many of Paul's friends who had been readily available to help out had gone on with their lives and weren't able to assist like they had previously. In terms of the business, financial struggles were becoming an issue, and other moving companies were beginning to take over Tough Mover's client base. Jerry, who had been a strong pillar for Sharon and the business, couldn't handle the stress any longer and moved away. In March of 2000, Sharon had no choice but to dissolve the business. By 2001, Paul's money had all but been spent, and in lieu of money for child support payments, the court allowed Teresa to take possession of his car as well as many personal items. Sharon struggled to keep paying the mortgage and life insurance premiums. Since Paul was still considered a missing person, his debts remained, and the life insurance wouldn't pay out. Sharon took on a job for a company that manufactured plasma bags for blood banks, but a devastating car accident left her unable to work. As a result, she began falling behind on payments and running up her credit cards to try and keep things afloat. She began to slowly accept that Paul was not coming home, and this acceptance led to a state of paranoia. She still lived in Paul's home, and believed that whoever had murdered her son and granddaughter knew where she lived. She began adding locks to the doors and keeping the curtains drawn at all hours as her mental state degraded and she fell into depression and fear. In a bid to become financially solvent, Sharon attempted to sell Paul's home. Unfortunately, she was told that without a death certificate, she would be unable to do so. A missing person cannot be presumed or legally declared dead for 5 years, and so in 2004, Sharon petitioned Adams County to have Paul legally declared dead. It wasn't a cut and dry decision, as there was an ongoing investigation with forensic evidence, which, while it implied death, hadn't officially been determined yet. Sharon reached out to District Attorney Don Quick for assistance in hopes of expediting the process. Michelle Russell, Paul's ex-wife and Sarah's mother, was also involved in much around the case. She hired experts to conduct air, water, and land searches, and even employed private investigators. Over the years, she managed to raise $50,000 in reward money for information leading to an arrest and conviction, but to this day, that money remains unclaimed. It's a tragic experience for Michelle, who kissed her daughter goodbye one February morning, and all these years later, still doesn't have the answers as to why her life was taken and who was responsible for it. The questions surrounding this case continue to swell. Detective Pat Long was approached by Misha in early 2005 to discuss what had happened and why no answers had yet been uncovered. According to her, Long explained that it was the belief of authorities that all three had likely been the victims of a murder coming out of illegal drug activities they believed Paul was conducting. Long repeated this story publicly to the media, in which he reiterated that Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo were likely the victims of violence related to drugs. Police believed that Paul had been utilizing his business as a front for the distribution of marijuana, and that while this was not a major operation, it was large enough to have caught the attention of people who may have wanted to eliminate him. In terms of the crime itself, Long believed that the three were attacked upon their return to the lot. It's been suggested that Paul and Sarah were likely shot at the scene, and Lorenzo may have been taken along and murdered later. Police believe that the suspect moved the bodies and Lorenzo into the truck and then drove it somewhere to dispose of them. In the first few months, detectives had interrogated more than 80 individuals, but found no new evidence or compelling statements. Interestingly, Long did imply that they had knowledge of who may have been responsible. In a statement to the media, Long said, quote, "In my opinion, I believe we know or we have a strong feeling who is involved in the murders." End quote. With Long having made this statement, it seemed to imply that authorities were investigating the case as a triple homicide, but some weeks later, there would be another strange turn. Sharon had a meeting with Howard Morton, the executive director of Families of Homicide Victims and Missing Persons, about raising funds to erect a billboard near the Tough Movers lot, which would depict Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo in hopes of drumming up tips and leads. At the unveiling, in Westminster, a representative from the Westminster Police Department announced that they were taking over the case, and that the Thornton Police Department would no longer be involved. Morton later stated, quote, "They informed me that day, as we stood out there, did our stuff in front of the cameras, that the case was being transferred from Thornton to Westminster. They said it's been treated as a missing persons case up until now, and now it's being treated as a homicide, and we're giving it to Westminster. Here we are, 6 years later, and they are just now going to take it seriously as a homicide?" End quote. Sharon and Misha were both upset by the change of jurisdiction. Since the early days of the investigation, both had developed a good field of communication with Detective Pat Long. Sharon spoke to him weekly, and Misha contacted him nearly monthly. While both were upset by the lack of developments, they felt that Long was dedicated to the case and was working hard to figure out what had happened. Now, with the change, they worried they would be cut out of the circle. Later, District Attorney Don Quick stated that there weren't many new ideas on the case, and that while they had some beliefs about what had happened, they didn't have the evidence. Quick had a connection to Sarah. His family owned a cabin down the street from Sarah's mother's home in Granby. Quick stated, quote, "One of the hardest things is getting people to understand that there is a difference between knowing and proving. If we had the evidence, we'd file the case. There's nothing I'd like better than to bring Sarah's murderer to justice, even if I didn't know her." End quote. In December of 2006, Sharon was finally issued the death certificate, which afforded her the ability to sell the home. Unfortunately, the legal wrangling revolving around this case would devastate her. The home was sold in May of 2007, and the funds were placed in an account overseen by probate court. Now with Paul legally declared dead, the conservatorship which Sharon had been the head of was also dissolved. The court determined that the money in that account should go to Paul's son with Teresa. Sharon brought in an itemized account of her expenses in relation to the estate, totaling over $93,000, but the judge dealt a harsh ruling. According to Judge John Popovich, Sharon's argument that she hadn't been able to sell the house until 2007 had no legal merit. In addition to this, the judge determined that while Sharon had expenses related to the estate, she had also lived in the home without paying rent. The judge determined that Sharon should have been paying rent beginning in November of 2000 at $1,000 a month. Sharon had been in the home for 78 months, and so the judge deducted $78,000 from her expense claim and awarded her just over $15,000. In another financial blow, the $65,000 from the sale of the home and the $100,000 life insurance policy would be awarded to Teresa's son. This stems from a 2004 motion in which Sharon had a paternity test done on Teresa's son, which had proven that he was in fact Paul's biological child. Ultimately, after court costs, a failed appeal attempt, and paying off her debts, Sharon was left with just $4,000 in an IRA account and was staying with friends and family without a permanent residence. When asked why she didn't simply return to Minnesota with her other son, Sharon responded, quote, "I guess at some point, I realized they might never be found, and so I might go back to Minnesota sometime. But right now, it just doesn't seem quite right. My job isn't finished until the bodies are found." End quote. While Paul's estate was settled in court, that remains the only aspect of this bizarre and disturbing case to be settled in any way whatsoever. Questions loom about what happened and why it happened and who may be responsible. While authorities and even the district attorney imply that they have a person or persons in mind for the crime, they lack the ability to prove it. In 2009, Sarah would have turned 20 years old, and reporters went to speak with her mother, Michelle, regarding Sarah, the case, and life after the loss of a beautiful 9-year-old daughter. Michelle tries hard not to be bitter about it, and she thinks about Sarah every day. On a beach in Maui, Michelle celebrated her daughter's 20th birthday with cupcakes and a small gathering, saying, quote, "It's pretty sad when the guest of honor is nowhere to be found." End quote. In the past 9 years, there have been no new breaks, no information released, no major updates on the investigation. Sadly, Sharon passed away in late 2013, having never learned the truth about what happened to her son or granddaughter. Michelle Russell, when asked about Sharon, replied, quote, "She died not knowing. People know what happened. They need to unload their guilt." End quote. Over the years, while answers have been few, theories have been plentiful. Among the theories, several stand out as major possibilities for investigators. The first theory considers the possibility that the abduction and murder of Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo may have revolved around an alleged drug operation. Whether this was an operation conducted by Paul himself, utilizing his moving company as a front, or was in some way related to drug dealers from whom Teresa alleges he had made purchases, is unsure. The second theory argues that the triple murder may have been conducted by someone Paul had previously had issues with, who has yet to be brought into the investigation. Some believe that this may be connected to Paul's cousin, while others argue that it's possible Paul could have been targeted by a former employee or even a competitor. The third theory argues that Lorenzo Chivers himself may have been involved in the crime. The fact that his DNA and blood have never been recovered, his vehicles found cleared of fingerprints, and there doesn't appear to be a link between he and Paul and Sarah other than working that day, makes many believe that Chivers may have committed this crime and then fled. The fourth and final theory relates to Paul's relationship with Teresa Donovan. Many who were around the couple have made statements about the tensions and fiery relations between the two. It's been suggested, based on Teresa's statements following the disappearance, Lorenzo Chivers' connection to her sister, and the anger and violent statements of her brother Tom, that Teresa Donovan may have hired someone to murder Paul. Sherry Spotke, a spokesperson for the Westminster Police Department, in 2014 said that the case, quote, looms over the families, friends, and detectives from the Westminster Police Department as an unsolved homicide. This part of the story we know. An innocent 9-year-old girl, Paul Skiba, was caught in the middle of a triple murder. End quote. For investigators, the case is at a total standstill. Without further information, a confession, or some break in the case, they may never uncover the truth. In 2014, it was announced that evidence was being reprocessed under new technology, but no new information has been revealed about this. If alive today, Paul would be 58, Sarah would be 28, and Lorenzo would be 55. It's been 19 long years since their families have seen their faces, heard their voices, or been able to share their time with them. Far too long for their case to have gone unsolved, in a situation where almost everyone believes that the people responsible are known to authorities. While for many, the goal is to determine what happened, for others, it's about finding solace in closure. To Michelle Russell, it's less important to her to know what happened, and far more important to bring her daughter home. Russell stated that she would appreciate it if someone would give her the location of Sarah's remains, even if doing so anonymously. She told reporters, quote, "The thing that goes through my mind all the time is that I've got to find her. I really want to bring her home." The disappearance and murder of Paul and Sarah Skiba and Lorenzo Chivers is remarkably disturbing and baffling from many different perspectives. This is a case which has remained unsolved for more than 19 years and shattered 3 families. While it's disturbing enough for 2 adults to disappear and likely be the victims of murder, the fact that an innocent 9-year-old girl also fell victim to this crime adds a new level of pain and frustration to it. When you factor in investigative errors, rumors, and threats, it takes on a more overwhelming shape. Michelle Russell has never received the answers and wants only to bring her daughter home and give her a proper burial. Sharon Skiba went to her grave never knowing the truth about what became of her son and granddaughter. Misha Shiver, along with Josh and Aubrey, wonder to this day what became of Lorenzo and why those responsible have never been brought to justice. This case casts a dark shadow over law enforcement in Colorado, and yet despite the level of violence, the tragedy, and the impact to the community, this is a case which for many is still unknown. This is a difficult case to explore, as there are so many questions which remain unanswered and coverage has been limited. Murder was determined based upon large quantities of blood and pieces of forensic evidence found at the truck lot. Shockingly, despite being confronted by this overwhelming evidence, it took investigators a while to truly begin looking at this case as a triple murder. While authorities believe they know what happened, the how and the why have never been fully explained, and behind those answers, we might be able to find the who. 19 years later, the same questions which haunted friends, family, and investigators at the beginning remain today. In the absence of those answers, 4 primary theories have been suggested to explain this brutal and disturbing crime. The first theory connects the triple murder to an illegal drug operation. In 2005, some 6 years after this crime was committed, police stated that they believed the triple murder was motivated by drugs. There are 2 aspects to this angle which have been discussed. Firstly, Teresa suggested that Paul had some arrangement with drug dealers in which he rented out spaces in his parking lot to them and may have even purchased drugs from them, but at some point he severed that connection and had these vehicles towed away. The other angle, put forth by law enforcement, suggested that Paul was running a marijuana operation for which he used his moving company as a front. Taking a look at the first aspect, there are several interesting factors to explore. It's known that Paul often rented out parking spaces on his lot to other people. It was a quick way to make some extra cash, and probably a wise business choice being that he didn't need the entire lot for tough movers. Teresa has said that among those to whom Paul rented spaces were drug dealers. The number of these individuals has never been publicly specified, and there isn't a lot of information about how much Paul was being paid, how long the arrangement lasted, and what ultimately changed for this to have stopped. This is a highly speculative angle of this theory. Outside of Teresa's own words, we have very little to base it on. Teresa has implied that these were cocaine dealers and that Paul was actually purchasing cocaine. According to her, at the point where Paul decided he no longer wished to indulge in cocaine or be connected to the dealers, he told them that they would no longer be able to rent spots there, and when they continued to park, he had their vehicles towed away. While this isn't impossible to imagine, it seems highly unlikely that having your vehicle towed away would be enough to incite a triple murder, which would include the execution of a 9-year-old girl. If indeed there was a connection between these alleged drug dealers and the murder, many believe that it's more likely that something else was going on. There have been rumors that Paul, in his attempts to keep the dealers away from the lot, threatened to contact police if they didn't stay away. If these dealers felt threatened or believed that Paul might turn them in, the possibility of murder becomes more likely. A problem with this theory is the crime itself. If these drug dealers wanted to murder Paul, and obviously if they'd been using his lot, they were aware of his comings and goings, they could have done this crime at any point in time. Why would they choose to do so on an evening where Paul was not only alone, but had his daughter with him and another employee? If they'd watched the lot, or had been hiding somewhere while planning to ambush Paul, they'd have seen that he wasn't alone. Now, maybe it was a situation where they'd already gone beyond the fail-safe point and had no choice but to move forward. But again, they'd have had multiple opportunities prior to this. Without knowing when exactly Paul allegedly told these drug dealers to move on, it's hard to know how long it was planned and how many opportunities they had. But regardless, it doesn't seem like something that went without planning. You have to be aware that whoever committed this crime not only planned the murders, but also the removal and disposal of the bodies. If indeed one of the truck ramps was used to weigh down the bodies, they had to know how long it would take them to get there, that it was an area where they were unlikely to be seen, and that they would be able to get back and escape without being noticed. It's really interesting that this crime was committed on a day where Paul was actually not even supposed to be working. This implies that the killers either got lucky by choosing a day where Paul wasn't supposed to be there, and then he showed up, or perhaps that they weren't as informed about his schedule as some would believe. There is, of course, also the possibility that someone told them that Paul would be there that night, which is an angle we'll explore more in a later theory. Looking at the second aspect of this theory, we have the suggestion that Paul himself was running a marijuana operation. Police have openly stated that this wasn't a large drug operation, but that it may have caught the attention of people who didn't approve. Paul's family, in response to this allegation, have stated that while Paul was known to smoke pot, and yes, he'd been arrested for possession in the past, they didn't believe that he was in the business of selling drugs. When you look at it closely, the moving business would make a good front for this kind of transaction. Driving all over the state in a moving truck is unlikely to draw attention, and if you're making stops at various locations, it could easily be written off as moving work. That being said, none of Paul's clients ever admitted to purchasing marijuana from him. Now, maybe they wouldn't want to admit that and end up in trouble, but it seems like by this time, someone would have come forward and told some story about it. In addition to that, it's not as if Paul had a ton of cash laying around, which would signify that he was operating a drug business. His mother, after the murders, struggled to keep his finances balanced, and with probate courts and lawsuits, no one has ever found any quantity of money that Paul was concealing anywhere. Also, if Paul were smart enough to have a life insurance policy on both his mother and his daughter, wouldn't he be wise enough to have one on himself if he was doing something dangerous? I find it hard to believe that, if Paul's murder was the result of a drug operation, that someone, at some point, wouldn't have either warned him or tried to shake him down for cash. To simply step right up to murder is a rather large leap in logic, as, if you've got the power and the weapons, Paul could have been pressured into kicking money up and maybe have been worth more alive than dead. It's also important to note, in regard to this theory, as far as we've been publicly aware, no marijuana was ever found. It's not as if investigators located bricks of weed in the home or plants. So if indeed Paul was conducting this kind of business, he must have been doing it along with someone else who was supplying the product. Considering Paul's personality and statements about arguments he'd had with past employees, it isn't hard to imagine he could have gotten into a conflict with someone he was working with. But again, would murder be the primary answer to solving this problem? It's remarkably hard to say, and if you consider the possibility that a cartel may have been involved, then all bets are off. They're not known for giving warnings, but again, we see no financial indications that Paul was running any kind of operation which would have been large enough to have drawn this kind of attention. We don't know exactly what the police based this theory on. Perhaps it was a rumor, Maybe someone told them something during interrogation, but they believe it enough to have stated it as the only theory about this case they've ever gone public with. That makes it hard to deny, though without further information or evidence, Paul's alleged connection to drug dealers and his own drug business remains speculative at best. The second theory in this case explores the possibility that the triple murder may have been conducted by people who have never truly been ruled in as possible suspects. The suspect list itself is rather mysterious, as no one has ever been named as a suspect or even a person of interest. There have been suggestions that Paul made enemies through his job, firing former employees and having arguments with them. One of the primary examples presented was his own cousin, Herbert Michael Himes. According to friends and family, Himes had been an initial business partner with Paul when he started Tough Movers. After serving time in prison for robbery, Himes came out and Paul gave him a job. His second stint with Paul didn't last nearly as long, and the rumor was that Paul caught Himes stealing money from the business. We don't have a lot of details about this, and indeed, if it is true, then Paul elected to fire Himes and not report the theft to police. That isn't improbable to imagine, as Paul likely didn't want to do something which would result in his cousin going back to jail, but again, we can't know for sure. Himes has been rather angry in discussion of the topic, denying that he was fired for theft, and instead putting forth a statement that he voluntarily left the business because he was making money in the stock market. I've also read that Himes may have invested in a competing business to Tough Movers, but haven't been able to verify that. Regardless, relations between Himes and Paul were strained, to say the least, and Himes' response to reporters asking questions has been none too pleasant. It appears that he wishes to distance himself from the investigation and to make it clear that he played no role in the triple murder. While it's difficult to ascertain what type of person Himes actually is and whether or not he's capable of such a crime, it does seem unlikely that if he wanted revenge on his cousin, he'd also choose to do it while murdering Sarah and Lorenzo. Also, being that he was known to have issues with Paul, you'd have to imagine that investigators would have run down his whereabouts and possible involvement. Again, we can't know for sure, but investigators have said that they have a good idea of who committed the crime, and while there seems to be little to link Himes to the investigation, there isn't a great deal to rule him out either. Other possibilities include former employees and competing business owners. A common statement from locals in regard to this case is that it was an inside job, implying that someone either within the business or Paul's own social circle may have been responsible. Unfortunately, we don't have a great deal of evidence to support these possibilities, but they have to be considered. Could Paul have been a threat to another business? Could a former employee have wanted to seek revenge for being fired? Could someone Paul knew and trusted want to strike out at him and did so in this brutal and violent manner? Possibly. If police are so certain that they're aware of who may have committed the crime, this leads me to believe that it's likely that it was someone who was around at the time who may have in fact been a part of Paul's life. Under that belief, it isn't totally possible to rule out any of these suspects just yet. Some have argued that it may have actually been a current employee, which leads us to our third theory. 3 people disappeared on February 7, 1999. Blood, DNA, and hair from 2 of these victims was recovered from the Tough Movers parking lot. However, there has never been anything found to indicate that Lorenzo Chivers was abducted or murdered that day. For many, this leads them to believe that Lorenzo himself may have been involved in the crime. Looking at it over the past 19 years, that would mean one of 2 possibilities. Either Lorenzo was involved in the crime and fled afterward, or was initially involved in the crime and was murdered later and not at the parking lot. Following the first angle, we'd have to go to motive, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot to go on. There could be a myriad of reasons Lorenzo would have wanted to murder Paul. Perhaps they'd had a dispute. Perhaps Lorenzo was going to be fired, or they simply got into a situation that resulted in a lashing out of violence and anger. All of these are possible, but the situation itself does seem curious. Lorenzo's car was found in a parking lot in Westminster, not the parking lot where the trucks were found. For some, this indicated that Lorenzo may have committed the crime, then driven out of the lot, locking it behind him, and abandoned his car elsewhere. Of course, if Lorenzo were planning to flee and didn't want to be connected in any way, it would have made more sense to abandon his car at the main lot, since then it would look like he'd have gone with the victims and had been taken too. Lorenzo's car was wiped down for fingerprints, which has made many wonder if it's possible when this crime was committed, the killers split up, with one taking Paul's car and the other taking Lorenzo's. Neither vehicle resulted in much forensic evidence, which implies that whoever parked them may have been connected to the murders. In terms of the why, the only connection anyone has ever been able to make, outside of the possibility of a personal or work-related issue, is the fact that Lorenzo was, at the time, living with Teresa Donovan's sister, Bobby Jo. As we progress further in these theories, the Donovan family name comes up a lot more frequently. Is it possible that Lorenzo had been involved in the murder due to his connection to Bobby Jo, and in turn, Teresa? Maybe. Bobby Jo allegedly made odd statements when asked about Lorenzo. From day one, she seemed to believe that he was never coming home, and within days of the disappearance had already packed up his son's belongings. For many, that's very strange behavior and indicates some knowledge of what may have happened. It's certainly not smart behavior, as if Bobby Jo were involved or knew what happened, you'd think she'd want to at least act like she didn't, but not everyone in the world is a criminal mastermind, and in a panic, people make stupid choices. People involved in crimes often expose themselves by going to great lengths to distance themselves from what happened, and it's certainly possible this occurred here, but the question becomes, was Lorenzo asked to participate in this crime only to run off, or was he asked and then set up to be murdered himself? The second angle of this theory examines the possibility that Lorenzo may have participated in the crime and then was murdered afterward. Many believe that Lorenzo may have been used, either to set Paul up or to help with the murders. Some argue Lorenzo may have been involved in moving the bodies, which would explain why neither his blood nor DNA was found at the scene, and that once he had served his purpose and helped dispose of the bodies, he too may have been killed to cover it up and protect the other responsible party or parties. This is certainly a possibility, though no evidence has ever been raised to connect Lorenzo to the murders. From everything we know, he was a kind man who had only been working with Paul for a short time. An interesting connection is that Teresa's brother, Tom Donovan, who had displayed a great deal of anger towards Paul's family and friends, stopped working for Paul around the same time that Lorenzo started. Another piece of this puzzle, which some have found suspicious, is Jerry. Jerry was a close friend of Paul's, had worked with him, and following the disappearance, had worked closely with Sharon and the business to try and help out before moving away. While no one seems to think that Jerry was involved, it is curious that he was the one who was supposed to be working that day, not Paul. Is it possible that Jerry was the target, and everyone else was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Maybe, though Jerry was never targeted again if that was the case. Some have even argued that Lorenzo himself may have been the target, and being that Paul was supposed to be off, he and Sarah were sadly caught in the middle of something for which they played no part. While that's possible, it seems odd that their blood and DNA would be found at the scene, and not Lorenzo's, were this the case. Lorenzo remains a mystery piece of this puzzle, but for authorities, he's never been listed as anything other than a victim, never a suspect. The fourth, and final theory, brings together all aspects of the Donovan family in a highly complicated angle involving betrayal, money, jealousy, and revenge. Teresa Donovan was living with Paul at the time of the murders. Her sister Bobby Jo was living with Lorenzo, and their brother, Tom, had been fired by Paul just a few months earlier. For many, they believed that this family, or members of it, were involved in a plot to eliminate both Tom and Lorenzo. The motives are as old and solid as motives can be, with Teresa doing it for money, Bobby Joe for jealousy, and Tom for revenge. Beginning with Teresa, we know that things between she and Paul weren't going well. Almost no one in Paul's life approved of Teresa and found her to be difficult, to say the least. Paul had expressed openly that he was unhappy with their arrangement, questioned the paternity of their son, and wanted Teresa out of his house. He'd suggested to others that, did the child turn out to be his, he'd go to court to seek full custody, as he found Teresa to be an insufficient parent. Sharon has stated that Teresa wasn't very kind to Sarah, and it's been made clear how much Sarah and her happiness meant to Paul. If Paul left Teresa and won custody, she would be in a position where she wouldn't be granted child support payments, she'd need a place to live, and she'd still be on disability. It's interesting to note that Teresa's disability actually came from her mother. Due to the disability, so long as she remained single, she continued to be on her mother's insurance policy at age 26. Were she to marry, that would end, and that's the argument Teresa made in court as to why she and Paul weren't technically married. We know that Paul had a $100,000 life insurance policy on Sarah, as well as owning a lucrative business and a home. Were Teresa to marry him, and then either divorce or some unfortunate accident were to occur, at a minimum she'd be the beneficiary of the business and the home. Were something to happen to Sarah and Paul, she'd also be subject to the possibility of that $100,000 life insurance policy. Money is always a major motive for murder, and sadly, people have been murdered for much less than $100,000. But the idea of murdering a man and his 9-year-old daughter gives a much more monstrous aspect to the would-be plotters and killers. Teresa has been very outspoken about the fact that she wasn't involved, while simultaneously stating that she failed a polygraph. While I don't put great stock into polygraphs, I probably wouldn't be publicly announcing it if I failed one either. So then, why would Bobby Joe possibly want to participate? Well, Lorenzo was living with her at the time, but his ex-wife, Misha, has been very open about the fact that she and Lorenzo maintained good contact and were, at the time, in conversation about possibly getting back together. Details about Lorenzo's life have been few and far between, but it isn't impossible to imagine that Bobby Joe could have become aware of this and been exceedingly jealous or angry about it. Angry enough to hire someone or to commit to keeping her mouth shut about a triple murder? Maybe. It's very hard to say, not knowing much about her. The Donovan family, while speaking out early on in the investigation, has been remarkably quiet for years now, refusing to comment. That doesn't necessarily imply guilt, but it is curious when everyone else does continue talking and they remain silent. Remember, Bobby Joe packed up Lorenzo's son's belongings within days of the disappearance and also said that she knew something horrible had happened. While this statement has been viewed as speculation, what if it wasn't? While Teresa and Bobby Joe have only stated things subtly or made minor implications, Tom Donovan has been much more direct. According to Jerry, Tom threw rocks at his truck and told him he was next. According to Sharon, Tom called the home and said that Paul and Sarah had been shot and that he was going to shoot her too. According to Bob Martinez, Tom made a hand gesture like he was going to shoot Sharon while they were in court together. Tom's relationship with Paul had degraded thoroughly enough for Paul to fire him, and almost everyone who was aware of the situation has said that Tom certainly had anger and hatred towards Paul, his business, and his social circle. Tom has been described as dangerous, violent, and angry, certainly 3 key features of someone who might be willing to commit murder. For many, it's less a question of if they were involved, and more a question of how. Some have argued that Teresa, Bobby Joe, and Tom were directly involved. Others believe they may have hired people to commit the crime, possibly including Lorenzo, who was then taken out as part of the cover-up. Perhaps, but I don't see much of a connection to Lorenzo in this crime. Regardless, these 3 names have been the most frequently stated when it comes to the murder, and Teresa herself has acknowledged that police have almost directly accused her of the crime. Could these be the people law enforcement are referring to when they've stated that they have a good idea who was responsible? A spouse or significant other is always considered a suspect early on in a case such as this. Well, in this case, you've got two significant others and their allegedly violent and angry brother who is said to have had a grudge against one of the victims. I don't believe this theory is impossible, and for almost everyone who examines the case, it is the prime and most probable theory. Unfortunately, we may never know, but were I investigating this case, this is certainly where I would begin. The problem for me with this entire case has always been the murder of Sarah. While it's terrible enough to murder two adult men, it's a completely different level of horror to also execute a 9-year-old girl. It feels like going to this extent implies one of a few things. Either the hatred was so personal that Sarah was included as a target, or the crime was commenced before the killers were aware that Sarah was present, or, from day one, Sarah needed to be included in the crime in connection with the life insurance policy. It's also important to remember that Paul was off that day. How did the killer know he would be in the lot that night? Only a few people knew: Jerry, who he was covering for, his mother, who he had told, and Teresa, who he lived with. Bobby Joe may have known, had Lorenzo mentioned it to her, but outside of that group, it wasn't common knowledge. Either Paul was the prime target of this murder and the others were collateral damage, or Paul and Sarah were targeted. It seems unlikely that this crime was planned and Paul and Sarah just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The possible connection of this 19-year-old unsolved triple murder to a family for whom many had issues with the victims is quite difficult to overlook. The triple murder of Paul and Sarah Skiba and Lorenzo Chivers is a truly heartbreaking, maddening, and brutal case to examine. The level of frustration that goes along with digging into the evidence is hard to describe. Poorly examined evidence, half-assed police work early on, and since then, nearly 19 years of silence. 3 families continue to wonder what happened. Paul's father and brother continue to live on, wondering if they'll receive the answers that Sharon fought for until she passed away. Misha, Josh, and Aubrey have never received the details which would tell them what became of Lorenzo, and due to the absence of this information, also deal with the pain of his name being bandied about as a possible suspect. Michelle Russell dropped Sarah off for school one morning, never knowing that she'd never hold her beautiful little girl again. 19 years later, and this case, which for all intents and purposes feels like it should be solvable, remains one of the most tragic cold cases in Colorado history. If you're interested in finding more information about the murders of Paul Skiba, Sarah Skiba, and Lorenzo Chivers, there are a few articles and forums discussing this case. If you have any information about the triple murder, please contact the Westminster Police Department or the FBI. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Special thanks to Daniel from the Facebook discussion group for mentioning this case recently and inspiring me to finish up my coverage of it, as well as Patreon producers Krista Colvin, Lynn Merschel, and Diane Dyson. If you have time, perhaps you can visit podcastawards.com and help nominate Trace Evidence. The procedure is simple. Click on Listener Nominations, register, and then vote for Trace Evidence in the People's Choice Award and Society and Culture sections. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you're using. The more ratings and reviews the show gets, the more people are able to hear these unsolved cases. For more information about other cases, transcripts, media, and more, please visit the website at trace-evidence.com. I want to thank you for listening to this episode. I'm going to leave you with a promo for another podcast which I thoroughly enjoy listening to, and I hope you will too. So join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.
Do you get mad when listening to true crime? Well, so do I. If you want a weekly true crime podcast that says what you're thinking, then grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. This is Cambo from True Crime Island, another true crime podcast, and maintain the rage with me. Visit truecrimeisland.com where you can download or stream each episode, plus there's links to iTunes and social media. And as I always say, don't forget to delete your browser history. This is True Crime Island.